Today, titled From the Red Sea to the South China Sea, who's responsible for safety and freedom of navigations. And for session number 3, it is a great honor to invite Her Excellencies Ms. Carmen Cano de Sala, the Spanish ambassador to Vietnam, as the moderators, and also welcome to Vietnam ambassadors.
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody. I'm really very glad to chair this panel on such a timely and broad topic. I'm also glad that this panel gathers experts from different regions, and therefore I'm sure that we can have a very lively and complementary discussion. We have experts from Canada, Singapore, Israel, and US based in the UK. So allow me first just to share with you a few general comments in order to frame this discussion. And I would start with the obvious, which is the importance of sea lanes for connectivity, international, political, and economic stability. Therefore, we can consider maritime safety to be a global good and therefore share responsibilities. We have discussed in the previous session about challenging times, complex geostrategic framework, geopolitical competition, a weakened multilateralism, international law being eroded from inside from the same actors who are supposed to protect it. We are also facing new trends such as non-state actors, gray zone tactics, and new technologies. And all of this is affecting maritime safety in the region that we are going to talk about right now. From the Red Sea to the South China Sea, the South China Sea is connecting the Indian and the Pacific Ocean. The Red Sea, through the Suez Canal, is connecting the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. So there we have a maritime highway between Europe and the Indo-Pacific, which makes even more important to preserve safety and freedom of navigation. So how to deal with these current circumstances? How to sail these uncharted waters? Do we have enough tools? As a Spanish ambassador, I will follow very attentively all the interventions of our panelists, because Spain is a maritime country, and also, as you know, Spain is leading Operation Atalanta to ensure safety against piracy in the Horn of Africa. So without further ado, I will give the floor to our first panelist, who is Eric Laporte, a seasoned Canadian diplomat, expert on security and defense, and a long career including NATO headquarters and posts in Afghanistan and Lebanon. So the floor is yours, Eric.
Thank you very much, Carmen. Thank you to the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam for the kind invitation to speak today. Good afternoon, everyone. It really is a pleasure to talk today on an issue that matters to all. As we found out this morning, the discussion is timely. The maritime domain underpins our shared prosperity, connectivity, and security, and yet, in recent years, we're seeing the active erosion of the rules-based maritime order. As a maritime nation with the world's longest coastline, bordering 3 different oceans, and reliant on international trade for its prosperity, safe and secure seas are fundamental to Canada's well-being, as they are for many countries of the Indo-Pacific and beyond. Increasing militarization of essential waterways, Exaggerated maritime boundary claims and the use of coercive actions to threaten and intimidate other states or their commercial fleets risks escalating disputes into dangerous conflicts. The growing use of dark or shadow fleets, commandeered to be used for illicit activities such as illegal fishing, smuggling, and sanctions evasion, allow for the secret movement of prohibited goods and complicate day-to-day maritime safety. The rapid growth of Russia's shadow fleet, for example, used to transport Russian oil and circumvent Western sanctions following the invasion of Ukraine, has been linked to an increasing number of oil spills, collisions, and other maritime incidents across the globe. These ships are not only a hazard to other vessels, but also to coastal communities who rely upon essential waterways for their access to food, goods, and energy. Incidents involving critical maritime infrastructure, such as undersea cables and pipelines, are also increasing in frequency and have the potential to negatively affect millions globally. None of these challenges are restricted to a single region. Whether in the Baltic, Black, or Red Seas, or right here in the South China Sea, these things are happening. While some are resorting to the use of force to press their claims, solutions require dialogue, not force, and collective action to maintain freedom of navigation in these key regions. In the Red Sea, we are seeing the Houthis threatening the freedom of navigation by conducting attacks on commercial shipping to further their own political goals. As one of the world's most critical waterways, as mentioned by Carmen, channeling 12 to 15% of global trade and 30% of global container traffic, this is very concerning. In responding to this challenge, we of course are calling on those who have leverage over the Houthis and their backers to exercise it for maximum effect and for the benefit of all. For Canada's part, we are contributing military personnel to the Combined Maritime Forces, a grouping of 46 nations focused on maritime security in Middle Eastern waters, and we're also supporting Operation Prosperity Guardian and EU Op Aspides. Only by working jointly with our allies and partners for the common interest of maintaining freedom of navigation, according to international law, can we address these current challenges. Turning to the South China Sea, I want to point out that Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy acknowledges that the South China Sea is one of the region's key security hotspots. 20% of global trade, 1/3 of global shipping flows through the South China Sea annually, making it one of the world's most strategically and economically vital waterways. Its waters also provide important fishing stock and resources, which are vital for regional food security and environmental resilience. Its subsea oil and gas reserves are also a valuable source of energy to help meet the growing demand of the region. These factors mean that a crisis in the region would potentially have global ramifications. That is why Canada is seriously concerned about China's increasingly coercive and destabilizing actions in the South China Sea. The recent escalation of intimidation tactics against several ASEAN partners in the South China Sea, including Vietnam and Philippines, continues to raise serious concerns regarding respect for international law and the ability of states to exercise sovereign rights within their exclusive economic zones. We strongly condemn the acts of violence directed at Vietnamese fishermen on September 29th that resulted in bodily harm. These actions not only jeopardize safety, but also infringe upon the rights of all nations to operate peacefully in these waters. Canada calls on all parties to abide by the provisions outlined under UNCLOS and other relevant international laws. The implementation of international law, including UNCLOS, is essential to guide the peaceful resolution of contemporary maritime boundary disputes. It is for this reason that Canada works with partners in the region to support the rule of law, navigation and overflight rights, along with effective management of maritime resources. Adherence to a common set of rules applicable to all countries, both big and small, is critical for our common security and prosperity, and the safe management of our global commons. In this regard, we commend ASEAN's commitment to finalizing a code of conduct for the South China Sea at an early date. We heard this morning 2026, let's stick to that date. And we reiterate our support for a code of conduct that affirms the rights of all states to the lawful use of the region's waterways. For Canada's part, we are committed to enhancing our presence in the region under our Indo-Pacific strategy to create more opportunities to work side by side with allies and partners to protect international law. This includes an augmented presence of the Royal Canadian Navy and expanded defense and security relationship with key partners. It also includes bolstering borders and law enforcement, cybercrime, anti-money laundering, and counterterrorism financing, and developing domestic and regional countries' capacity to combat cyber threats. Under Operation Horizon, the Canadian Armed Forces are playing a more active role in the region to help promote, with our allies and partners, greater peace and stability. This includes participation in regional activities, exercises, and operations to demonstrate Canada's commitment to promoting the rule of law and the importance of rules-based international system. Just this July, for example, His Majesty's Canadian ship, Montreal, conducted a port visit to Ho Chi Minh City, demonstrating our commitment to a free and open Pacific. The Canadian Armed Forces are also working closely with partners in a multinational effort to counter North Korea's ship-to-ship transfers and other efforts to circumvent UN sanctions on the high seas. In addition to near persistent presence of Royal Canadian Navy frigates in the region, our dark vessel detection program uses Canadian technology to support oceans management initiatives and expand measures against illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific recognizes the importance of enhancing cooperation in the maritime domain to overcome shared challenges and to better enable a peaceful, sustainable, and inclusive Indo-Pacific. These objectives we parallel in our own Indo-Pacific strategy. Canada values the central role ASEAN plays in the evolving regional security architecture, and we are supportive of lawful commerce, navigation, and overflight rights along the effective management of maritime resources. We look very much forward to co-hosting the next ASEAN Regional Forum workshop on UNCLOS this year, in the new year, with Vietnam, alongside with our Australian, EU, and New Zealand colleagues. Fostering greater partnerships within the ARF strengthens ASEAN's centrality and supports peace and stability. By working together and enhancing dialogue amongst all parties in support of international law, we can foster an Asia-Pacific region where peace prevails, commerce flourishes, and all countries can pursue their rightful interests. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. Thanks for stressing the importance of protecting international law and the global implications of maritime crisis. So you have focused more on the South China Sea, also stressing the impact on coastal communities, because it's important to see the relation between land and sea. Maybe I will give the floor now to follow talking about these issues to Ilona Drozdov. Ilona is coming from Tel Aviv, so you are probably the only guest we have from the Middle East in this conference. Ilona belongs to the Dvorah Forum, which is a forum for women experts on security and foreign policy, and she's also an expert on technology applied to maritime safety and effectiveness. So the floor is yours.
Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's both an honor and a critical responsibility to discuss one of the most pressing concerns in global maritime security, the safety and freedom of navigation. Today, I will walk you through the complex responsibility of ensuring safety and freedom of navigation across two crucial maritime regions, the Red Sea and the South China Sea. We will explore the challenges posed by state and non-state actors, the limitations of international law, and the role of technology in shaping maritime security. So the concept of freedom of navigation is often portrayed as a neutral principle, but in reality, it reflects the interests and power dynamics of dominant nations. Each country interprets and applies maritime laws in ways that can lead to divergent perspectives on what constitutes legitimate navigation rights. This divergence fuels instability in the international order. Recent events, particularly those involving the non-state actors, such as the Houthis in the Red Sea and geopolitical tensions arising from China claims to the South China Sea, further complicate the norms on freedom and safety of navigation, posing significant risks with long-term consequences. These challenges underscore how power struggles, competing interests, and regional conflicts can disrupt safe navigation. Addressing these tensions in these two regions requires cooperative frameworks among the Indo-Pacific, Middle East, and Europe regions, as they are connected. With interregional collaboration, we can ensure that navigation remains safe, open, and stable. So when we're talking about geopolitics, we should start with a map. Two regions of great strategic importance because these are waterways that together carry a significant share of the world's shipping traffic. The Red Sea links the Mediterranean Sea with the Indian Ocean via the Suez Canal, which carries about 12 to 15% of world trade. Similarly, the South China Sea accounts for 21% of global trade. When disruptions occur, the consequences are severe. Rising costs disrupt supply chains and increase geopolitical tensions. Maintaining maritime security in these waters is essential for global stability. I should also mention that impacts and consequences of these maritime disruptions extend beyond the exporting and supplying countries. They also affect all importing countries. Maritime security is the interest of a wider range of stakeholders than only those who are directly impacted by these specific attacks. The Red Sea region illustrates the growing threat posed by non-state actors, particularly the Iran-backed Houthis. After a decade of regional conflicts involving state actors such as Iran and Saudi Arabia, the Houthis have emerged as a significant game changer. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, a critical checkpoint for global shipping, has become a flashpoint for these tensions. Since October 2023, the Houthis have carried out more than 130 drone and missile strikes on commercial and military vessels, disrupting nearly 20% of maritime trade in the region. These attacks had a cascading effect on shipping activity, with the number of ships passing through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and Suez Canal falling by 55%. Consequently, shipping costs rose by 440% as routes were adjusted to navigate around the Cape of Hope, and all this alongside rising oil prices. The nature of these attacks, both widespread and alarming, as they target vessels linked to multiple countries, even in ally, while leveraging inexpensive technology. By ally, I mean the Chinese ship that was attacked this March, which basically questioning the overall command and control capabilities of the Houthis. So, moreover, the Houthis now expanding their presence to the Indian Ocean. And as a result, has been significant economic damage on a global scale, despite the presence of international naval forces in the region. This highlights the urgent need for a collective response that recognizes the growing role of non-state actors in the maritime security. So on the other side of the world, we have the South China Sea, where the security environment is shaped by state-driven disputes. China territorial claims overlap with those of Southeast Asian nations, including Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Taiwan, and Brunei. China has adopted gray zone tactics, including the deployment of paramilitary forces and provocative actions, such as AI-enabled water cannons used to attack the Philippine ships, and tilt-trotter drones, which was just recently presented by China. These tactics blurred the lines between military and civilian operations, allowing China to exert control without engaging in direct military conflict. This gives the potential to revolutionize the non-lethal combat. And of course, China's disregard for UNCLOS rulings create a precarious situation, leading to increased risk of confrontation. So when we compare the Red Sea and the South China Sea, we find both similarities and differences in these security dynamics. Both regions have vulnerable choke points impacting global trade and security. Emerging technologies such as UAVs and cyber tools have complicated maritime security in those regions. However, while the Red Sea is primarily dominated by non-state threats, the South China Sea is characterized by state-driven disputes. That said, the South China Sea also faces asymmetric threats from Chinese paramilitary actors. Additionally, the Red Sea lacks of unified governance framework, while the South China Sea operates under contested interpretations of UNCLOS. Both regions share the challenge of eroding maritime norms that need to be addressed. So as coming from the Middle East, I was thinking what lessons can be learned from the Red Sea regarding the impact of non-state actors and the legal challenges, and how can we adapt our strategies to enhance maritime security in the South China Sea while fostering cooperation along the critical sea route between Asia and Europe. So there are few, and they are mainly concentrated over three topics. The first one is role of non-state actors. The Houthis campaign in the Red Sea demonstrates the expensive and adaptive nature of irregular warfare, as well as the growing role of non-state actors in the maritime domain. They operate outside the frameworks of international law, challenging maritime security. As irregular warfare becomes more frequent or more regular, international recognition of those threats is crucial. New frameworks are needed to effectively incorporate non-state threats into maritime security discussion. And the lesson could be to think of incorporating asymmetric threat responses into their strategies. The second point is fragility of international law. The Red Sea highlights the limitations of legal frameworks like UNCLOS. The failure of the UN Security Council to authorize the use of force against the Houthis and the stance of Russia and China on this issue demonstrate how legal gaps are exploited for geopolitical gain. Just to remind that Russia and China abstained on resolutions 2722 and 2739, while both countries are well known of their use of non-state actors. Here, the lesson would be that legal frameworks like UNCLOS must adapt to new security threats to maintain their credibility. Next point, and most interesting in my opinion, is the impact of new technologies. The use of disruptive and innovative technologies by non-state actors in the Red Sea shows how low-cost technologies can outperform traditional defenses by creating an economic asymmetry in defense and attack. The Houthis, backed by Iran, have used advanced anti-ship cruise missiles and UAVs to disrupt maritime operations. In response, state had to deploy expensive defense systems, meaning a significant financial burden for its economy. So basically, in the picture, you can see the defense system that was launched to intercept UAVs of cost of $20,000 at maximum. So the lessons here could be as follows. Reactive responses put state actors at an operational and financial disadvantage. Proactive strategies integrating technology innovation and international cooperation are essential. States must adopt flexible, adaptive military frameworks to counter evolving non-state threats effectively. So securing free and safe navigation in the Red Sea and the South China Sea requires stronger international cooperation. To summarize the case, the key insights and recommendations for fostering maritime security cooperation in these critical waterways are: first, building a maritime security ecosystem connecting the Indo-Pacific, Middle East, and Europe will help bridge the gaps. Collaborating across navies, tech companies, and research institutions will improve knowledge transfer, R&D, and create tailored responses to emerging risks. Here I open the brackets and I said that the main goal here is investing in human capital and information sharing. The next, we need to recognize non-state actors as common threat and strengthen our legal frameworks. Pirates, militias, and other non-state actors are becoming more sophisticated, and the current legal framework is often insufficient to handle these threats. It's essential to adapt maritime law and provide clear engagement guidelines to maintain security without compromising international legal principles. And lastly, embracing technology and innovation is crucial. As non-state actors continue to use low-cost technologies like drones, we need to develop affordable and scalable solutions. For example, in Israel's defense system, we offer a model of combining innovative thinking, foresight, and partnerships between industry and academia. However, implementing these recommendations won't be easy. Competing geopolitical interests, resource disputes, and trust issues among stakeholders remain significant challenges. But if we can overcome these, so the recommendation can significantly enhance maritime security and create a foundation for future diplomatic solutions. So just to sum up, a shift from reactive defense to proactive cooperation is essential for ensuring maritime security in the Red Sea, South China Sea, and beyond. We must combine technology, international cooperation, and legal adaptation to address today's challenges. Technology and law should not be viewed as obstacles, but as enablers of long-term stability. Maritime security is a shared responsibility. Cooperation across regions and sectors is not just an option, it's a necessity. Together, we can build sustainable ecosystems that safeguard maritime trade and ensure the free and safe movement of vessels across the world's most critical waterways. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilona. I think it's a very interesting comparison between the South China Sea, the Red Sea, the challenges, key lessons, the need for international cooperation, and I stress without undermining international law. So from the Red Sea, we move to the South China Sea, And then I would like to give the floor to Ivan Laxmana from the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Singapore. Ivan is also the editor of Asia Pacific Regional Security Assessment, specialized in Southeast Asian security. So the floor is yours, Ivan. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Good afternoon, everyone. I know it's just after coffee break, and I know it's a slow day. So hopefully, I'll try to be very brief in what I have to say. First, let me say thank you, as always, to my friend Hung Son and DAV for having me. One of the increasing truism in Track 2 Southeast Asian Circle is when DAV calls, you better answer the call. And so here I am. So thank you for that kind invitation. Second, before I speak about subsea warfare in Southeast Asia and what it means for the region, let me say that I took the freedom of interpretation, I guess, from the request of the organizer when they asked me to talk about who's responsible for freedom of navigation. And let me explain a little bit why I chose today to talk about subsea warfare. First, I think I try to present some of the preliminary thoughts that we have as part of an ongoing project on subsea challenges across the region, as well as anti-access capabilities. And so please bear with me as I give you a somewhat surface level take for a subsurface topic. And secondly, as opposed to providing a helicopter overview of freedom of navigation, I tried to change the other way around and look at a bit more specific issues on subsea and how does that eventually take us into a much broader set of issues around freedom of navigation, but it's something that's somewhat perhaps in the near or even a medium-term future. So I do admit that a lot of what I'll be talking about may sound somewhat theoretical, but given, I think, the challenges around the region, the growing tension that we've seen in the last few years, and certainly the boundary between wartime and crisis and peacetime is not as clear-cut as before. Hopefully, some future-oriented discussions will be useful. So today, I'll speak about three main things. First of all, what exactly is subsea warfare that I want to talk about? Second, why should we all care about subsea warfare? And lastly, I'll try to talk about some of the options that we could consider here in Southeast Asia to respond to those current and future challenges. To put it simply, subsea warfare is the use of subsea assets like submarines and other systems in a particular military or non-military operations within or from the subsea or under the water. And of course, from a military standpoint, there's always an offense or defense element to subsea warfare. And what we have seen for almost 100 years now has to do a lot with submarine and anti-submarine warfare. But as we move towards an environment that is increasingly contested, it's certainly much more than just about submarines and their proliferation, but it's also about future mine and counter-mine warfare. We see this in the development of anti-access capabilities around the region. Australia is also seeking some of that capabilities. And of course, in the future, concerns about seabed warfare is perhaps the next stage of that evolution. Now, seabed warfare, I think, in particular refers to the kinds of operations that would affect what is known as the underwater critical infrastructure, or UCI. This could come from submarine cables, oil and gas pipelines, and we've seen some of these examples in Taiwan, for example, last year in Matsu, and of course in Nordstrom as well in Europe. And so these concerns about seabed warfare is now increasingly a part of the conversation around the region. But why does it matter for us here in Southeast Asia? This sounds like an advanced country problem. It sounds like a first world problem. Well, it's not. It's definitely something very much close to us here in Southeast Asia. I think first, in the era of contested domains, resilience is part of deterrence. And what more important part of our resilience than it is the ability to communicate, the ability to maintain energy, and it's not just about oil and gas anymore, but it's also the transfer of renewable energy. I saw yesterday there was a deal between Australia and Singapore that will allow some of the renewable kind of sources of energy from Australia to be transported to Singapore in the future. So subsea assets and underwater critical infrastructure is not just about military communications or even the internet. But that's certainly, I think, a key reminder that in the era of contested domains, resilience is an important part of deterrence. A second reason is, of course, subsea warfare is a nexus. It's a nexus of multiple strategic trends happening in the region, whether it's about military movements, whether it's about trade and digital economy, but also in terms of the development of emerging technology. And this is part of what I think in the discussion points that were provided, I think will be part of a wider discussion on freedom of navigation. And of course, the role of non-state actors, perhaps somewhat different from the Red Sea that was presented earlier, but this is the role of businesses in particular in maintaining those underwater critical infrastructure. The four most biggest operators of subsea cables come from the civilian side, and the competition between US and China will eventually bring us concerns around the fragmentation of those subsea cables between HMN as well as Subcom and others. So this area is part of an increasing US-China competition more broadly. And in the case of underwater challenges in particular, the emerging technology of robotics, AI, processing, and computing technology, sophisticated oceanographic models, cheaper UUVs, or what is known as underwater unmanned vehicle, cheaper aerial drones, and even satellite imagery has led some experts to believe that within the next 20, 30 years, there's going to be much more transparency in the ocean, that it's hard to hide things in the future. But the problem is, of course, for us in Southeast Asia, as we've heard for much of the day, there are competing maritime claims that remains unresolved, not just in the South China Sea, but also between the Southeast Asian states themselves, as I'm sure Malaysia and Philippines would agree, as I'm sure Indonesia and Malaysia would agree, as well as many others. So this remaining congested, unresolved, and undiscussed maritime claims also leads to different maritime capabilities, priorities, and of course experience in the underwater domain. In terms of underwater surveillance, very few are actually capable to do that, despite Vietnam, Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia kind of operating submarines in their fleet. So what do we do for the future? So a few set of options, I think, is we're thinking about for the region, from a unilateral, bilateral, unilateral, as well as an ASEAN framework. On the unilateral side of things, I do think each country now, particularly in the maritime states, should start considering developing an underwater hub, a research hub. We see this in the case of Italy, for example, where you bring in universities, civilian maritime law enforcement, but also from the military and the business community to improve underwater research and situational awareness. Of course, this speaks to a much broader concern around naval modernization across the maritime states of Southeast Asia that remains, I think, stagnant and hard to move beyond major surface level assets and capabilities. On the bilateral side, of course, the need to improve claims and clarification per UNCLOS and the initiation of delimitation talks should still be part of that conversation. We do not have to wait for the COC to start talking among each other on clarifying claims. There's nothing that says Philippines and Malaysia and Vietnam has to wait for the COC before they start having their own talks. On the unilateral side of things, I think certainly this notion of trying to develop an underwater security dialogue, particularly between Track 1 and Track 2, could be potentially useful. There's a few challenges that we don't understand quite yet, from the business side of subsea cables to the military side of submarine capabilities, all the way down to maritime law enforcement and others. But that form of Track 1 or Track 2 dialogue, I think, could be useful. The need to develop an underwater information sharing framework, I think, will be useful. And we don't have to start new. We have existing models we can use, from the Malacca Straits Patrol to the TCA and even the IFC in Singapore. We can add on some of these additional requirements to start thinking about the kinds of underwater incidents and information sharing before we eventually move to joint monitoring, training, and exercise on the underwater side of things. And lastly, let me end for the multilateral side on ASEAN. There is certainly some role for ASEAN to play in this sense. Of course, the issue of socialization and norms building is an important one for ASEAN, but also in terms of regulations and norms around subsea cable protections is something that ASEAN can nudge even further. And some countries, in fact, I would say most countries in Southeast Asia have not had a clear legal strategy as well on thinking about intentional damage to subsea infrastructure in the future. But of course, the most challenging part about ASEAN on this side of the house is that these kinds of issues fall under the economic pillar, which is, it falls under the ASEAN ministers of the digital affairs side of things, not on the security side of things. So this, I think, has not been elevated to the level which is necessary to discuss this as a security issue. And let me end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Evan, for bringing a different perspective, equally important, on the same topic, and also for proposing new tools regarding, as you mentioned, the development of underwater information sharing mechanisms, etc. I think this complements very well what previous speakers have said, not only in this session, but also in previous sessions. Thank you very much. And now I would like to give the floor to Fred Kenny. We have talked a lot this morning and also in the afternoon about legal tools. Any session has mentioned UNCLOS, international law, multilateral world. I know that you have broad experience not only working for UNCLOS, but also in the IMO. And I think the IMO hasn't been so much discussed in the previous sessions. So I think that you could give us the IMO perspective that you know well regarding instruments to promote trust and also the challenges to current cooperation in these and other frameworks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. And good afternoon, everybody. First, I wanted to thank the DAV for organizing this conference and for the invitation here to speak. It's really an honor and very much appreciate it. When I saw the title of this conference, or of this panel, who was responsible for safety, security, and environmental protection, I thought, oh, this will be easy. I can talk for 15 seconds, say it's the flag states supported by the coastal states and the port states. Will be done in 15 seconds. We can all go out on the veranda and enjoy a nice drink. But of course, it's a little more complicated than that. And I want to get into some of the issues that we have, particularly with respect to the regulation of ships and shipping. Now, UNCLOS, particularly in Articles 91, 94, and Part 12, sets out the responsibilities for flag states through compliance with generally accepted international regulations, procedures, and practices. And UNCLOS and the IMO treaty regime really place that responsibility on the flag states. And it is the IMO that develops those internationally accepted regulations, procedures, and practices as the competent international organization under UNCLOS to develop those regulations. Then it comes down to a matter of implementation. And while there have been significant advances in flag state implementation of the IMO treaty regime, particularly since 2016 with the advent of the IMO's member state audit scheme, we're still a long way from where we need to be. Thus, the role of the port states through port state control and coastal states through coastal state action in ensuring compliance with the IMO treaty regime for safety, security, and environmental protection really remains critical until we get to the point where we have universal adoption of the IMO treaty regime, supplemented by consistent implementation and practical enforcement and compliance, we still have a lot of work to do. Now, I was listening to the previous panel regarding some of the opportunities for ASEAN and their limitations, and it was reminiscent to me of some of the issues that we have at the IMO. And I would say that right now there are three main things holding the IMO back and preventing it from being a bigger player in ensuring flag, port, and coastal state adherence to the rule of law in the maritime domain. And one of those three things with respect to the IMO is its size and its resourcing. The IMO is one of the smallest agencies in the UN system. While it's resourced for its size fairly well by the member states, it still only has a secretariat. It's budgeted for a secretariat of 265 persons, and with some other funding has about 325 or so at any given time. But by UN standards, that's an extremely small secretariat, particularly given the responsibilities that the IMO has when you look at the efforts to reduce or eliminate greenhouse gas emissions from ships, when you look at the current safety and security issues that we're seeing. It's a very small staff to support those things, and I would say that the Secretariat right now is really maxed out and cannot really expand its capabilities too much because of the resourcing issue. The second issue is, in my view, underutilization of the authorities that are granted in the IMO Convention. And I think that is, the reasons for that underutilization are, one, historical, and two, intentional. The first notion of having an international organization to deal with maritime matters actually occurred in 1889, and that proposal was rejected. The leading proponents of the proposal to create an international organization at that time were the Scandinavian countries, and the leading opponent of it was the United Kingdom. And the reason for that was the United Kingdom was the dominant maritime power at the time, and they were concerned about A, interference with the British border trade, and B, competition or a large international organization lording over them and affecting their competitive advantage. Fast forward to 1946 to 1948 when the IMO was formed, and you'll see that the leading proponent of creating an international organization at that time was the United Kingdom, and the leading opponent at the time were the Scandinavian countries. Their roles had reversed because their competitive outlook had changed. So it really came down to the economics of shipping that have driven the organization, and the drafters of the convention intended to have a small, rather weak organization. Indeed, until 1983, the organization was known as the International Maritime Consultative Organization, and there was an article in the convention that has now been repealed that said the organization would be consultative and advisory only. It was left to the member states to determine, make their own decisions with respect to the implementation of any treaties that were recommended to them. And how does that manifest itself in terms of underutilization of the convention? Well, it does so in a number of different ways. First, you constantly have thoughts expressed in the IMO that it is a technical organization, even though nobody can really define what technical is. And indeed, what is a technical matter versus what is an economic matter, which the IMO tends to shy away from, really depends on the mood of the member states and the political will of the member states to take on an issue. And in the end, it really results in a red herring. The IMO will do whatever the member states decide it's going to do. And so if you look at Article 1C and Article 3 of the IMO Convention, that allows them to get involved whenever discriminatory practices affecting the availability of shipping to the commerce of the world are involved, those sections of the convention have actually never been used in the history of the organization. When you look at maritime security, another example that's particularly relevant here, those words never appear in the convention. Thus, the IMO has to do some gymnastics whenever they get involved in a maritime security issue to make it a maritime safety issue. And you saw that through the development of the conventions for the suppression of unlawful acts against the safety of navigation, which is our counterterrorism treaty regime styled as safety, or the International Ship and Port Facility Security Code, which are actually contained in Chapter 11 of the International Convention on the Safety of Life at Sea, or SOLAS. The third issue is that the IMO lacks an operational arm. It has no ability to mobilize in an operational sense, despite the fact that within the Secretariat, there's considerable expertise and experience operationally that could be utilized but tends to be underutilized. And there are examples of this. When you look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and the issues involving the development of the Black Sea Grain Initiative that ultimately allowed grain to get out of Ukraine. The IMO actually was brought in and ultimately wound up leading the initiative in its early days because other agencies in the UN system didn't have that expertise, but they had to be seconded to another UN agency because IMO couldn't do it themselves. When you look in the Red Sea at the FSO Safar situation, which was a floating storage unit that was in Houthi-held territory or Houthi-held waters that was in danger of either exploding or sinking, which would have caused an environmental disaster, that needed to be removed. The oil needed to be removed and made safe. The IMO was called upon to do that, but it didn't have the capability to lead it. And then when you look at the current situation in the Red Sea with the Houthi attacks on merchant vessels, the IMO really is limited to just making statements by the Secretary General and passing resolutions. There's very little else that it can do. So in conclusion, there are opportunities out there for the IMO, and whether those opportunities are realized really depends on the political will of the member states. And I see the red light just went on, so I will stop now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for bringing IMO into the discussion and also for giving some historical background, which helps us to see the need of constant update, sometimes in a very creative way, so that we can meet new challenges and evolving challenges. So maybe, well, I see so many hands that I don't need even to raise the first questions. I will start giving the floor to the audience. So I see one there, please.
Thank you. Thank you. No. It's on? Right, I think I'm on now, and I'll speak loudly. The acoustics are rather difficult in this room, in this hall. I direct my question to Evan Lakshmana. I found your presentation.
Sorry,
loudly, right? Can you hear me now?
I think the mic is a bit echoey, right?
Can you hear me now?
Sure.
Okay. My question is directed towards you. I found your presentation quite interesting. You talk about subsea cables, and my first question, the first point I want to raise is, what concerns you about subsea cables? Where are you envisaging some kind of state-sponsored terrorist act which could interdict and interrupt or cut these cables? That's the first one. Second one, you mentioned underwater challenges and underwater challenges, and you mentioned ocean transparency. Very interesting, because ocean transparency is something we discuss in my center, because it can make submarines detectable in the future, which will have a very dramatic effect upon the deployment of submarines in this part of the world. And you also referred to AI, I understand, artificial intelligence. We're looking at command and control systems with embedded AI. We discuss that in our center. Now, my question is related to all of your presentation, because these ideas are very abstract. They're not related to any specific context. I would like to see you relate these ideas and these concepts and these technical developments in terms of military modernization to the South China Sea, because in the South China Sea, as we know, China is relying upon the maritime militia coordinated by the Coast Guard, fishing vessels and so forth, which are below the radar of conventional military, conventional naval power. And so everything that you say could be rather irrelevant to the issue of the South China Sea. I'd like your comments on that.
Maybe we collect a few questions, and then I also give you time to elaborate the answers over there, do you think?
Thank you, Ambassador. My name is Himret Smay, Executive Director of the Cambodian Center for Regional Studies. I have two questions directly addressed to Dr. Ivan Laxmana. The first one is related to Professor Brzezinski's question as well. What kind of this defense strategy that ASEAN state should have to strengthen their preparedness and response capabilities, especially in the event of maritime security, potential maritime security crisis, such as open conflicts? That's the first question. The second question also to Dr. Ivan as well, and maybe other speakers can contribute as well. Who or what should be the guarantor of freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, especially in terms of real enforcement mechanism? Thank you.
Thank you very much. One more question, and then we try to give some answers, Professor.
Yeah, I have a comment rather than a question. Beckman from Singapore. One is, there is no threat to freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. Commercial vessels go through the major sea lanes without any interruption whatsoever. Also, there is no threat of non-state actors in this region. So I think the two, Red Sea and South China Sea, are not comparable. With respect to cables, there is an interesting issue, because China's claims in the South China Sea allow it, under its law, to require a permit for any cable being laid within the 9-dash line, which creates a serious problems for Southeast Asian countries' connectivity, because the delays have been many months or sometimes years before there's approval.
So maybe, Ivan, would you like to answer the first questions?
Sure. Thank you for those questions. I think certainly Bob's response has answered some of your response, right? And questions. But let me, I guess, speak about, first the abstract stuff, right? In terms of the concerns around subsea. And of course, when it comes to the cable, it's a different set of problems when we talk about submarine and anti-submarine warfare, about oil and gas and energy grid. So that's that's somewhat separate. But in terms of submarine cables in particular, I think certainly the concern from a commercial sense is repair capabilities. It tends to be quite long to get the repair facilities on time. I think in the Asia Pacific in general, the repair time tends to be among the longest in the world, despite having quite centrality in terms of location and activities. I think something along the lines of like 150 to 200 faults per year. Of course, most of these faults are attributed or have been attributed to natural disasters, unintentional damage by fishing activities, dredging, and others. So it's not necessarily intentional with a malicious intent. But I think the concern is that in the future, can that be a potential source of pressure point or coercion? And one of the discussions, for example, for those who look at Taiwan is what happens if they do try to sort of cut off Taiwan subsea cables in the event of a blockade of some kind in that particular part of the world. So the concern around coercion and pressure point, I think also relates to Bob's point, which is right now, even before war, there's already the permit issue, right? And so that, I think, creates an additional pressure point in terms of the South China Sea stuff. But I think you're right that it is somewhat theoretical and abstract now, but the day-to-day management of the digital economy, the plans, I think it certainly also affect different Southeast Asian countries somewhat differently. I think when it comes to subsea cables in Southeast Asia, I think perhaps Singapore is the most resilient, something like 25, 26 cables that lands in Singapore. And that's why it's resilient, because there's a lot of redundancy built. But the rest of Southeast Asia are far from resilient in that sense. I think Malaysia is about 20-ish. I think they're trying to move that even further. Indonesia is about 17, 18. Philippines, less than a dozen. And Vietnam, I think 4 or 5. And so in that sense, if your economy, if your future strategic plans depends on the internet, in the case of Singapore, if the cables basically provide the internet that services 90% of your public service, it's kind of a critical thing. And so in that sense, in the era of contested domains, it's hard to see these vulnerabilities as simply a commercial problem or fixing and not safeguarding. And so this is where I think some of the future thinking around underwater security needs to be part of the conversation. On broader capabilities and strategy, that was part of the question. I think certainly the problem with Southeast Asia is that, as I said earlier, the priorities are just so vast. Most of the time, even I would say 80% of the time, many maritime Southeast Asian states are worried about the day-to-day operational security challenges, whether it's illegal fishing, whether it's maritime law enforcement in general, a transnational crime, armed robbery, etc. These are the things that occupy policymakers on a day-to-day basis, but very few actually spend time thinking about the longer term, but perhaps somewhat more existential strategic challenge around these issues, whether if there is a future regional contingency in Taiwan or the South China Sea, or even in domains that we haven't really fully thought about, like the undersea. And so the challenge is, of course, first of all, the reality is, despite, maritime Southeast Asia are technically maritime states, except for Singapore, I would say everybody is basically an army-dominated defense establishment. And when you have contradiction between an army outlook of strategic thinking and the maritime environment, you have challenges around trying to develop future strategies and capabilities to respond to those maritime contingencies down the line. So there is a deeper set of defense policy pathologies, if you will, that we haven't really quite figured out. Lastly, I think when it comes to sort of the relevance for all of this for the South China Sea, not just in terms of the subsea cable itself, but presumably in a future contingency in Taiwan or the South China Sea, if you are a military war planner, you have to, sorry, there's flies flying around too, or mosquito, I'm not sure. This is part of the gray zone tactics, I guess. Yeah, it's a drone fly, I hope not. I think what's tricky is that any future capability and contingency planning has to account for the subsea, not just from the perspective of military command and control and the internet and all of that, but presumably the kinds of assets that we now see being developed, for example, with regards to AUKUS, but also the modernization of Chinese nuclear subs and others. Certainly a deterrent feature of the thinking of many in the region has to do with the subsea domain. But we don't really know much about what to do on these issues. And in fact, very recently, that the maritime Southeast Asian states are starting to think about submarine training and safety assets beyond just buying the submarine as an attack vessel. And so there's, I think, a lot of considerations about future scenarios and abstractions, but it's only when we start planning for things somewhat more seriously and discuss some of these potential more seriously that you start to see perhaps some of the gaps in the policies and capabilities. So right now, it's abstract, even more abstract, because we haven't even started discussing it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you have answered all the questions so far. Maybe we could take two questions from the audience, which is connected online. There is one for Ilona about freedom of navigation. There are two. Yeah, yes, I'm focused on the second one. If freedom of navigation is not neutral and often reflect dominant powers thinking, how can smaller nations add change to this prejudice? And it's true, the second one would be, you talked about threats from non-state actors' drone usage. How about states' usage? And there is a third one from Hanoi University. Maybe we can take it later, because I think that can be answered from any of you. Would you like to take it?
Sure. So first, I would like to start maybe with the neutrality of the FON concept. I think it's a great question, and I think the answer would be the ecosystems that I proposed that are multi-layered, and this is the place, this is the platform where smaller states have a choice and have a voice through different platforms. So when we're talking about new technologies, I would say that states like Israel, which still concerns like a small country, has a voice because it has a strength in technology innovation, and all these inputs in the end of the day provide also track 2 discussions. And this is also the place where the voice of smaller countries can be heard. So I would say again, just to sum up, that we should think about ecosystems that involve all the countries, all the regional countries and interregional, and all the layers, which is both academies, institutions, as well as private companies and government. Now, talking about technology, I think the both questions are pretty much about the same. The drones usage. The states are also using drones, but there is a thing about cost effectiveness. So we saw examples also in Israel-Palestinian conflict, but also in Russian-Ukrainian, where there was use of costly drones by states, while non-state actors or controversies were more effective by using the low-cost drones. So by low-cost drones, I'm talking about FPVs. It's something that you can order by AliExpress in I don't know, in $100 or something like that, and put on this camera and use it for your goals. So states do use drones, and they use it almost effectively. But during the war, during the conflict, they understood that basically the smaller drones, the low-cost drones, they are more effective in these operations. And when we're talking about emerging technologies, I would say that emerging technologies are double-edged swords, and that they provide opportunities for early detection and rapid response. So we can talk about different technologies. There is no need to specify something specific, but in general, we're talking about AI and also, again, UAVs of different aspects. And we just need it for better performance of countries when they confront the non-state actors. So we always need to be one step ahead. So if the non-state actor know to use cheap drones, I would say that the state actor should use anti-drone systems. And these examples can be like ongoing. What again, to respond? Yeah. So this is relevant also to the South China Sea region. And there was also a question or statement that South China Sea doesn't face non-state actors' concerns. I would say differently, because paramilitary and all these fishermen, they're actually non-state actors. And here we're going back to the problem of legally framing what is the non-state actor. So we can say now that fishermen are not non-state actors, but in 10 years, we will see that they present actually the same concerns as we have now with the Houthis, with also back then, 10 years ago, we didn't see them as something specific, something dangerous. And nowadays, Houthis is a game changer, which changed the whole maritime security in the region.
Thank you very much also for addressing some of the comments before. More questions over there?
Hi, thank you, Chair. This is Huang from ISI Institute. Two questions. First one to Ms. Aliona and Admiral Kenny. So Aliona said about how UNCLOS should be changed to adapt to drone usage, new technologies, so on and so forth. So what exactly do you mean by changing or upgrading UNCLOS? Do you mean by introducing more supplementing document, or amending it, or introducing new legal document, or maybe we can find a way to sneak it into one of those IMO regulations? And then to the other two speakers, you talked about the dark vessel program from Canada. You talked about, Evan talked about info sharing mechanisms and monitoring system. I was just wondering, because there's so many offers regarding MDA or info sharing software that have been offered to the regions. There's one from New Zealand, there's one from Canada, there's ACWA, IORIS system, there's Quad, IPMDA, so on and so forth. There's just too many of them. Is there a way to combine them all together? And then also, such information sharing system, they can also be used for counter purposes. For example, they can be used to highlight certain activities that some actors want to highlight. Some actors want to be seen at that certain spot to assert their claims. How can we address such limits? And then also, how can we use the information sharing system in a way that address a concern regarding sovereignties of actors as well, of country in the regions? Thank you.
Thank you. Fred, could you answer the first question about UNCLOS?
Okay, sorry, I had a little trouble hearing your question, but I think I caught most of it. And I see that there's a question online that is in a similar vein, where it says the IMO recently passed a resolution calling on all countries, especially coastal states, to address the risk of the dark fleet. What will Southeast Asian countries, ASEAN, and partners do? I think that also captures, if I could see where you are, that the gist of your question as well. Let me just say as an introductory remark on that, when you look at the dark fleet and the issues it presents, you look at the scourge of fraudulently registered vessels around the world, which is actually two different things, because the dark fleet, you have ships that are legitimately registered, but are basically operating outside any flag state control. With fraudulently registered vessels, you have ships that are operating with absolutely no oversight. And I would say that that poses one of the biggest threats that we can see to the international regulatory regime to ensure maritime safety, security, and protection of the marine environment. Having these completely unregulated ships plying the waters, particularly when you look at the threat if that ship is a tanker carrying oil, the threat is just enormous. Now, what can the countries in this region do? Well, I think there's a number of things that can be done. The first is oversight of the fleets under the control of the flags. It hasn't really become an issue with respect to dark fleet vessels or fraudulent registries in this particular region, although there are a lot of issues with some of the small island Pacific states dealing with fraudulent registries and also dark fleet registries. But if it happens, it's really incumbent upon the flag states to get on top of the situation and deal with it. But at the same time, with respect to fraudulently registered vessels and dark fleet vessels, it really becomes a port state and coastal state issue, particularly a port state issue, because the port state control officers have to be nimble enough and have enough information available on scene so that they can take action to shut these ships down when they come into port. We're seeing that happening in some instances, but probably not enough. And the fact that these ships are able to conduct ship-to-ship transfers offshore, eventually these ships have to go into port, and they need to be detained, and I would expect hopefully seized and taken out of business, because it's really the only way to protect the regulatory regime. Thanks. I hope I answered your question as well, but if I didn't, please ask it again, and hopefully I can hear it better.
Yes. You continue, and then we give the floor to Eric for the second part of the question. Yes.
Sure. So if I understood correctly, you're asking about changes in the UNCLOS, right? So I think there is no right answer. It's everything is up to countries. In the end of the day, the first issue that states should talk about, both unilaterally and multilaterally, is about conceptualization. So we need to conceptualize the threat, what is the winning, and what is the maritime strategy. Based on this, you will be able also to bring this framework. So when we're talking about legal framework, again, it's all about countries, how they define it. When we're talking about terrorism, so for now, we don't have a specific definition of terrorism. Each country chose to define it by itself. And in the end of the day, we're still continuing to address this challenge, everyone on the personal, but in the end of the day, we have to see it as an international problem. So the same with the maritime law. As better we conceptualize and define the threat and what is the win, the better we will be able to frame the UNCLOS and to adapt it to the challenges that we face today.
Thank you very much. Eric, the second question.
And thanks. If I understood the question was about, there's a multiplicity of sort of systems out there to monitor vessels and which ones to use. I mean, from a first point of view, I think these systems, monitoring, tracking ship movements are critical. They're important to provide domain awareness. Of course, there are, just like in any other commercial entity, there will be multiple commercial providers, and this is all sort of commercial proprietary software. So the question is identifying sort of which products, which systems are best to fit individual countries. Now, if there were a decision to look at sort of how to do this from a regional perspective involving more countries, I think that would be beneficial in terms of being able to share information across platforms. So all of that involves sort of making selection of programs, such as the Dark Vessel program or other softwares, but then also wanting to talk to the developers to make sure that there's connectivity and interoperability between different systems so that you can get sort of that shared picture for the region if you go there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think we can have a last round of questions. I see, please.
Thanks very much. Really interesting panel. Andy Murdoch from the UK. I'm just going to actually start with a follow-up from what Fred said. He thought he might be able to sum this up in about 15 seconds with the role of the flag state in this. I want to ask whoever in the panel wants to take it. We know that one of the issues is the ability of flag states to actually exercise control over what's actually happening on board the ships. And we see this materialize in ships getting up to illicit activity. We heard terms like the dark fleets. It also manifests itself in problems for the welfare of seafarers, as well as in terms of the conditions of treatment. In the convention, it talks about the need for a genuine link between the ship and the flag state. And this was something that was looked at in the first case before the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea. And you could say they took a relatively conservative approach in the meaning of what a genuine link requires. My question to the panel is it time to revisit that interpretation of the convention? Do we need a stronger link, an actual genuine link between the flag state and the ship in order to improve the control that flag states have over their ships? Thanks.
I don't know if there are other questions that we could? No? Okay.
Well, thank you, Andrew. I think that's a really good question. I think as an initial comment, I would say what the drafters and negotiators of UNCLOS viewed as the genuine link in the late 1970s and early 80s has significantly evolved to the point where I think what they meant by the genuine link in UNCLOS is an anachronism that really isn't useful in today's environment because they meant a genuine link between the state and the ship. Their point was to make sure that somebody was exercising effective oversight into what was going on in the ship, to include safety, security, and, as you mentioned, training, certification, and the welfare of seafarers, very importantly, through either the SDCW Convention or, more importantly, the Maritime Labor Convention of 2006. And this was in a time when ships were owned in one country, flagged in that state. The crew generally came from that country and were employees of the country. Now we have ships that are flagged in one state, crewed in another state, and the crew is arranged through a crewing agency. The ship is managed by a ship management company in another country. So I would agree with you that it does need to be revisited from the perspective of how do we enhance the regulatory regime to ensure that there is effective oversight of ship operations through the range of responsibilities in safety, security, environmental protection. And I think there's a lot of opportunity. And when you look at some of the issues that we have with some countries not exercising oversight over their privately run registries, I think that's where we really have issues. Can that model work? Sure, it can. And we see some of the large flag states doing that very effectively. because they have the resources and they have the staff to effectively exercise control over the ships. We see other registries where there's very little or no control being exercised, and that's where problems occur.
You want to add something before I close? No, it's okay. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I will not try to summarize such a rich discussion. I think it's very useful that you have brought new elements to the conference that hadn't been mentioned before. This will continue also in the sessions tomorrow, especially regarding new technologies and AI. I think our discussion shows the shared responsibility and also the need to respect and strengthen international law with UNCLOS at its core. So I would like to thank you all for coming here today. I'm the lucky one coming for very close, but you have done long travels and some difficult ones. So thanks for sharing your knowledge and your expertise with all of us. Thanks.
Thank you, Her Excellency Ambassador, and thank you, our honorable speakers. And now we'll move straight into a very special session, so no tea break. The special sessions will feature the voices of the next generations whose faces you will see soon on stage. But first, let us play a video clip that features some of the highlight of the young leaders' discussion so far.